They arrived as allies, not with banners of war, but with trade goods, silk, spices, and blessings. They knelt in the same churches. They prayed to the same God. They built homes beneath the same golden domes. And for decades, the Latins of Constantinople lived as honored guests in the heart of the Eastern Christian world. But what happens when a city begins to fear its own reflection? When the line between neighbor and invader is drawn not in deeds, but in blood, name, and prayer. By the spring of 1182, the hatred had ripened. It had fermented in silence, fed by years of resentment, by whispers in markets, by sermons twisted into venom. And then, without a declaration of war or a foreign banner raised, Constantinople turned inward. Doors were kicked in, altars overturned, monks crucified, children gutted in alleyways. Entire Latin quarters erased in a matter of days, not by soldiers, not by conquerors, but by their orthodox neighbors, by citizens who once broke bread with them. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't even vengeance. It was something darker, something primal, the kind of violence that doesn't need orders, only permission. The same permission that once set fire to braziers when faith was turned into fuel and 20,000 innocents were burned alive in God's name. And not long after, a conqueror would ride from the west, William, the bastard of Normandy, who taught the world that fear could be sharpened into law and mercy smothered under fire and stone. Different lands, different names. But the pattern is always the same. A city, a fear, a spark, and then a silence soaked in blood. But Constantinople's silence wasn't born from conquest. It was born from collapse. A sacred empire rotting from the inside. A massacre not caused by invasion, but by identity. This is where it begins, not with a siege, but with a throne in crisis, a boy emperor, and a snake returning from exile, whispering that salvation comes through purging. What happened next would change the course of Christian unity forever. It would stain the empire's soul with a sin it could never cleanse. And it started long before the first sword was drawn. It wasn't a war, it was a waiting room. Constantinople in the late 12th century wasn't dead, it was decaying in silence. On the surface, the city gleamed, marble colonnades, sacred relics, the chant of monks echoing off gold-plated mosaics. But just beneath there was rot, political rot, spiritual rot, a slow, imperceptible breakdown of what held the empire together, not by sword, but by suspicion. The empire had once stood as the last breath of Rome. But by 1180, its breath was shallow. The mighty Manuel Comnenos was dead, and in his place, his 11-year-old son, Alexios II, a child with a crown far too heavy for his head. The regency fell to his mother, Maria of Antioch, a Latin, a Westerner, a woman with a French name ruling over a Greek Orthodox world. To the people of Constantinople, this wasn't regency. It was occupation in silk. But empires do not collapse from incompetence alone. They collapse when fear finds form, and fear had found its symbol in the growing presence of Latins within the capital. Venetians, Pisans, Genoese, Catholics with their own churches, their own ships, their own rules. They lived in gated quarters, traded tax-free, and walked with arrogant ease past Orthodox priests. They were guests, but they behaved like landlords. The people noticed, and they hated. Every coin spent on a Latin ship, every priest who spoke Latin in a Greek neighborhood, every whisper that the empress favored her own kind. These were not trivial details. They were cuts, and cuts, when left to fester, turned to poison. The Byzantines had long memories. The great schism of 1054 still bled beneath their skin. They did not forget the sack of Orthodox churches by Latin crusaders. They did not forget the arrogance of Rome or the papal bulls that declared their faith inferior. And now, they were expected to bow to a Latin empress and feed Latin merchants while their own children starved. But resentment alone doesn't kill, it needs permission, and someone soon was going to give it. Constantinople had become a city waiting for a match. It had the fear, the faith, the fury, and all it needed now was a man to light the fuse. Someone charismatic, someone cruel, someone who would promise to cleanse the empire of its foreign disease and crown himself savior by bathing it in blood. He was already on his way, and he wasn't coming home to pray. He was coming to purge. He didn't seize power, he seduced it. Andronikos Komnenos didn't storm the palace with legions or raise an army of exiles. He walked back into Constantinople with a limp, a grin, and a story. A story the people were starving to hear, that the empire was being poisoned from within, that their boy emperor had been hijacked by a Latin woman with foreign gods and foreign greed, that the empire's soul could be cleansed, not by law but by fire. He was old, battle-worn, and exiled for most of his life, but that only made him believable. He had suffered just like them. He had been betrayed just like the empire. And now he had returned, carved from scars, cloaked in prophecy, to finish what his cousin Manuel had failed to do, purge the rot. He spoke like a prophet and smiled like a butcher. And the people, tired of bowing to a child ruled by a Latin court, raised their voices for him. They didn't crown him with gold. They crowned him with rage. But Andronikos didn't move fast. He moved smart. First, he wrapped himself in legitimacy, appearing only as a humble advisor to the young emperor. Then he offered protection, then retribution, then silence. One by one, those who resisted him vanished. Nobles loyal to Maria of Antioch disappeared behind palace walls. Latin merchants were arrested for fabricated crimes. Orthodox clergy who supported the Latin alliance found their churches emptied, their robes soaked in the mud of the street. The people cheered. Every arrest was justice. Every disappearance, divine. Andronikos wasn't purging enemies. He was removing witnesses. But the genius wasn't just in who he removed, it was in who he left behind. He let the city breathe. Let the mobs taste blood in controlled doses, not enough to break the city, just enough to make them crave the next drop. He became a mirror for their hatred, a vessel. And the darker the crowd grew, the brighter they saw him. He wasn't the monster, he was the exorcist. By the time he declared himself co-emperor, no one dared speak against it. The boy emperor was still alive, technically. But his voice no longer mattered. And soon, not even his breath would. Because Andronikos hadn't come back to share power, he had come to bury it. And all that remained now was to give the people what they truly wanted. Not a change in law, a cleansing, a reckoning. And it would begin not in the palace, but in the alleys, the churches, the markets, and the homes of the Latins. They weren't soldiers, they were symptoms. The Latins of Constantinople didn't come to conquer. They came to trade, to pray, to build lives in a city that promised fortune under the eye of God. But in the Byzantine mind, they were something else entirely, parasites wearing crosses. The kind that didn't kill you outright, but hollowed you out over time. They didn't wear crowns or wield armies. They wielded contracts, trade privileges, immunities, and worst of all, papal blessings. By the late 12th century, entire quarters of the capital belonged to them. The Venetians with their fleet and silver, the Pisans with their warehouses and arrogant priests, the Genoese with their spies and steel. They had their own churches, their own markets, their own laws. They walked the same streets as the Greeks, but not on equal ground. Their ships docked without paying tax. Their priests ignored orthodox rites. Their merchants bribed officials and laughed at Byzantine tradition. And when a local protested, they did not respond with words. They called on embassies, or worse, their fleets offshore. To the average citizen of Constantinople, the Latins were not neighbors. They were a slow invasion hiding behind incense and coin. They weren't guests anymore. They were termites in marble. But hatred wasn't born from numbers alone. It was born from memory. The people still remembered the great schism of 1054, when the Latin Church and Orthodox Church cursed each other from opposite ends of Christendom. They remembered the arrogance of Rome, declaring their patriarchs heretics. They remembered the Crusaders marching through their lands as if they owned them. And they remembered the fire, literal fire, when Latin soldiers burned Orthodox churches on their way east, all while claiming they fought for the same God. So when Maria of Antioch, a Latin woman, ruled over them as regent, the insult wasn't political. It was spiritual. It was betrayal in flesh. And when the city began to crumble, they knew exactly who to blame, not the boy emperor, not the nobles, but the men with foreign tongues, foreign gods, and foreign immunity. What began as quiet disdain became a doctrine of survival. Andronikos didn't invent the hate, he simply named it. He told the people that their wounds had a face, that their poverty, their hunger, their humiliation, it all had a language. Latin, and when people are taught that suffering has a language, they stop asking for justice. They ask for silence, but silence wouldn't come through policy or exile, it would come through something older, cruder. And soon they would no longer be asking, they would be screaming. And the screaming would begin where blood runs easiest, where trade meets faith, and churches have no soldiers to defend them. The knife didn't fall from the sky, it was passed hand to hand in the open. No royal decree was needed, no formal call to arms. The bloodletting that followed didn't come from orders. It came from permission, granted not in words, but in silence. In the way Andronikos smiled as the mobs grew restless. In the way the palace guards looked the other way when a Latin shop was looted. In the way priests began their sermons with the word cleanse. The first blows landed quietly. A Genoese merchant found dead in an alley, throat opened, coins untouched. A Latin priest dragged from his church, his robes soaked in wine and spit. Rumors whispered of Latin men taking Orthodox women, of secret Latin plots to poison the city's wells, of heresy being preached behind Latin doors. None of it needed proof. Fear doesn't ask for evidence, it asks for sacrifice. Andronikos gave no orders. He didn't have to. He simply withdrew the one thing keeping the mob at bay, consequence. And once consequence vanished, civilization followed. The quarter walls were the first to crumble, not from siege, but from within. Gates flung open, Homes stormed, men dragged from cellars and nailed to their own doors, women thrown from balconies, infants butchered on icons. The fire came later, after the looting, after the laughter. It wasn't wild, it was surgical, controlled. It knew where to go, which homes to burn, which churches to desecrate, which relics to shatter. What made it worse, what made it inhuman, was the calm. This wasn't the rage of war, it was the ceremony of cleansing, a mass exorcism disguised as patriotism, and everyone wanted a part in it. Bakers, butchers, monks, children. One eyewitness claimed the city felt lighter that day, like it had exhaled. Another said the streets didn't smell like blood, they smelled like redemption. But redemption is a dangerous drug, and once taken, it demands more. So the mob went further. They stopped looking for Latin names and started listening for Latin accents. Any foreigner became suspect. Any outsider became fair game. And for the first time in its long and sacred history, Constantinople, a city built by emperors and saints, sounded not like a hymn but a howl. But the worst wasn't over. The city had bled. Now it would rupture, and it wouldn't be soldiers who screamed first. It would be the ones who prayed. The prayers didn't stop the knives. They only echoed louder in the blood. Churches once reserved for sacred hymns became slaughterhouses. Latin monks were dragged from their altars, stripped, mocked, then mutilated before their relics. One had his tongue torn out for preaching in the wrong language. Another was nailed to the door of his chapel, his body left to hang like a grotesque icon of false doctrine. The mob didn't see priests. They saw intruders wearing vestments, heretics cloaked in gold. The Latin Quarter wasn't a battlefield. It was an unguarded execution ground. No resistance, no formations, no weapons, just merchants, families, widows, and children trying to flee a fire that no one had started with flame. They tried hiding behind symbols, behind crucifixes, behind papal scrolls, but symbols don't shield flesh. And in this massacre, faith didn't unify, it divided. The Orthodox mobs screamed Christ's name as they broke ribs and poured boiling oil down mouths that spoke Latin prayers. This wasn't a war of belief. It was a revenge for humiliation, dressed up as righteousness. Bodies piled at the mouths of alleyways. Corpses floated in the harbors. Latin ships, those that hadn't been burned, drifted empty, their crews butchered at port before they could even lift anchor. Witnesses described the waters turning thick and black, not with fire, but with blood and hair, and the shattered teeth of men who had once brought spices, glass, and wine. The economic arteries of the empire were being cut by its own hands, and the crowd cheered every slice. And still, Andronikos remained silent, not out of ignorance, out of intent. The blood was speaking louder than any decree, and it was speaking his name. What he had unleashed was not a riot, it was a ritual, a political baptism in blood. A purification by flame, not from foreign invaders, but from foreign influence. The mob didn't ask for coins or reforms, they asked for bodies, and the more they fed, the deeper the hunger grew. Even those who hesitated were pulled in, some for fear of appearing sympathetic to the Latins, others because hate, once sanctified, becomes addictive. By the third day, Constantinople had stopped pretending. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about justice. This was a city in holy delirium, drunk on its own scream. And as the streets filled with silence again, it wasn't peace that returned. It was something colder, something more controlled. Because now that the enemy had been purged, the city turned its gaze elsewhere, not outward, inward, toward its own throne, toward the boy who still wore a crown too large. The last to die wasn't a foreigner, it was the empire's own blood. While the gutters still ran red with the lives of merchants and monks, Andronikos turned his gaze upward to the palace, to the boy emperor whose silence had allowed the purging, but whose breath was now an inconvenience. Alexios II was not an enemy, he was worse. He was a symbol of legitimacy that Andronikos no longer needed. For weeks, the child had been paraded as a puppet, his face shown to the crowds to justify the terror, his name attached to decrees he never wrote. But now, with the Latin threat extinguished and the mob fully devoted, the boy was a loose end. A soft, fragile relic of a regime Andronikos had already buried in fire. And so the empire watched as one final ritual unfolded, not in the streets, but in the silence of the throne room. The boy was strangled with a bowstring, no blade, no spectacle. Just the slow, ceremonial collapse of breath, a method reserved for emperors, a death considered dignified in the twisted etiquette of Byzantine power. But there was no dignity here, only the sound of history erasing itself. The body was buried without procession, no mourning, no relics, no prayers. The name of Alexios II was scraped off the marble, as if cleansing the empire meant purifying its memory. Andronikos crowned himself not as a usurper, but as a savior, the man who had delivered the people from heresy, from corruption, from foreign infestation. He walked through the same streets still reeking of burnt flesh and was hailed not with fear, but with reverence. The people didn't see a tyrant. They saw the wrath of God in human form, a man who had bled the city clean and left only truth in his wake. But truth in Constantinople had become elastic. It bent to the screams of the mob, to the sermons of frightened priests, to the ambitions of a man who knew that blood bought loyalty deeper than gold ever could. And now that the Latins were gone and the child emperor silenced, Andronikos stood alone at the summit of power. Yet power built on screams never stands still. The mob always needs something new to burn, and the empire, though silenced, was still full of voices. Voices that remembered, voices that doubted, voices that whispered not in Latin, but in Greek. When the enemy outside is gone, the knives turn inward. Andronikos had purged the Latins. He had strangled the child emperor. He had soaked the city in holy blood and called it salvation. But violence, once unleashed, doesn't end when its purpose is fulfilled. It mutates, it feeds. And now, with no more heretics to kill and no more children to silence, the people began to look at one another. Who had stood too close to the old regime, who had hesitated during the purges, who had watched and said nothing. The fear that had once unified the mob now began to isolate it. Friends turned cautious, priests turned quiet. Eyes that once burned with holy fury now darted with suspicion. Because the fire had not gone out, it had merely changed direction. And Andronikos, for all his cunning, knew it, which is why he acted first. His rule became a theater of paranoia. Nobles were dragged into public squares and beaten for imagined conspiracies. Women were arrested for allegedly weeping over the dead emperor. A man was executed simply for owning a ring with the old imperial seal. These were not trials. They were performances, demonstrations of control through humiliation, power through spectacle. The same crowds who once cheered him now watched in silence, unsure whether clapping or blinking would earn them the same fate. The executions were no longer righteous. They were erratic, grotesque. Bodies were mutilated, hanged from city gates, or thrown to wild dogs in front of the Hagia Sophia. Some victims were stripped naked and paraded as traitors before being drowned in barrels of excrement. Others were sewn into sacks with wild animals and tossed into the sea. These were not punishments, they were messages, and the message was simple: no one is sacred. Andronikos didn't rule by law or lineage, he ruled by horror. And in doing so, he dismantled not just the political order, but the social trust that held Constantinople together. Merchants stopped opening their stalls. Monks began hiding their manuscripts. Mothers told their children to stop asking questions. The same city that once screamed for blood now whispered prayers in locked rooms, unsure which god still listened. But gods weren't coming, not to save them, not this time. Because the empire was no longer suffering from outside threats, it was devouring itself from the inside. And soon, the world beyond the city walls would hear the silence and mistake it for peace. Silence is louder when it follows screaming. From the outside, Constantinople seemed calm again. The mobs had disbanded. The streets no longer ran red. Trade resumed. Bells rang from the domes. But underneath the surface, the empire was hollow. Andronikos had strangled his last threat and installed himself as the supreme voice of order, but it was a voice echoing inside a tomb. The Latin West had heard of the massacre. Survivors who escaped the bloodbath carried more than scars, they carried stories. And stories, once told across seas, festered into fury. In Venice, in Rome, in the courts of Western Europe, whispers turned into plans. Not just for vengeance, but for repayment, because Constantinople hadn't just killed its guests. It had slaughtered Christian merchants, priests, pilgrims, under banners that were supposed to mean alliance. Treaties were torn. Embassies closed, trade died, and with it, the empire's last economic lung. But the real curse wasn't the boy Andronikos killed or the priests he burned. It was the debt he left behind, a spiritual debt, a stain the Church of Rome would not forgive. The unity of Christendom, already cracked by centuries of theological spite, now shattered entirely. The schism was no longer academic, it was soaked in bodies. The East had not just broken from the West, it had bled it. Andronikos tried to repair what he had shattered. He sent envoys, he offered apologies laced in poison, but it was too late. The West did not see an emperor. They saw a butcher crowned by cowards. They remembered the flames of Basias, and now they had a name to match it: Constantinople. A city once called the New Rome, now whispered as the heretic's throne, and the West would not forget. 20 years later, an army bearing the cross would come, not to defend Christendom, but to avenge it. They would not come to liberate the Holy Land. They would come to loot the city that once claimed to be holy. The Fourth Crusade would not ride against Muslims or pagans, but against fellow Christians, because the blood spilled in 1182 had never dried. It had only darkened. But before that reckoning came, before the walls were breached and the sacred relics shattered, the people of Constantinople would face one final judgment. Not from the west, not from Rome, but from within. From the very same mob that once hailed their butcher a savior. The hands that raised him now tore him apart. Andronikos had crowned himself with the blood of foreigners and silenced his own emperor with a bowstring. He had ruled through fear, worshipped as a purifier, a savior draped in divine rage. But mobs do not remain loyal to gods they can see blade, and when the fear turned inward, when even the loyal began disappearing, something shifted. The same people who once chanted his name began spitting it, quietly at first. Then openly. It began with rumors that Andronikos consorted with demons, that he bathed in children's blood, that he had sold Constantinople's soul for one taste of power. It didn't matter if they were true, they felt true. Because the horror had become unbearable. Because even tyrants eventually forget the rhythm of their own terror, and when they overreach, when the public spectacle turns private nightmare, the crowd remembers it as teeth. The uprising was not noble, it was not righteous, it was savage. Andronikos tried to flee disguised as a peasant. He was caught at the docks, dragged by his hair through the city he had once ruled. The people didn't want justice. They wanted reversal. They wanted his pain to mirror their fear. One tooth for every name disappeared. One rib for every child crushed. His eyes were gouged, his beard torn out in strips, his genitals mutilated before a shrieking mob. He was strung up by the ankles between two columns, beaten for days, fed to the dogs while still breathing. There were no laws left, only echoes. The crowd that killed him did not chant prayers, they laughed. Because nothing is more terrifying than the joy of the betrayed, and nothing more Byzantine than a Messiah crucified by his own choir. When it was over, no one spoke his name, not in mourning, not in damnation, only in whispers, warnings. Not of tyranny, but of collapse, because Andronikos wasn't a man, he was a mirror, and what the empire saw in him was not his cruelty, it was its own. The fires of vengeance may have cooled in Constantinople, but the embers smoldered across the sea. Embers that would one day be fanned by armored pilgrims, those who would come not to pray, but to pillage. And when they came, they didn't break the city. They finished what had already been broken. Empires do not die when their enemies break the gates. They die when their people forget who the enemy is. In 1182, Constantinople didn't fall to invaders or heretics or kings. It fell to itself, to its fears, to its rage, to the belief that purity could be bought with blood and salvation could be chanted over corpses. And in doing so, it became the very thing it claimed to fear. What happened in those streets wasn't just a massacre. It was a warning, a prophecy carved in flesh, echoed in flames, and answered years later by armored men who came not to heal, but to burn. Because the blood spilled in God's name never stays buried. If this story struck something dark in you, watch what happened when another city turned faith into fire, in the massacre at Byzantium, or see how a conqueror used fear to build an empire in William the Conqueror. And if you believe history's silence can be louder than its victories, subscribe to this channel. We don't tell stories of glory, we tell the ones kingdoms tried to erase, because sometimes the crown doesn't fall, it rots from the inside.